time is a river. But what happens when that river flows through a galaxy where memory stretches back tens of thousands of years? The answer is the Old Republic, an age so distant and vast that its events feel more dream than record a quiet foundation beneath the familiar stories of Skywalkers and Death Stars. The story of this era begins not with Star Destroyers or clone troopers, but with scattered worlds staring into the dark between the stars and wondering what waited there. In that darkness, the Force moved unseen, a calm current beneath every future conflict, every empire, every Jedi and Sith that would rise and fall over time. This invisible energy bound ancient civilizations together long before they knew each other, existed for thousands of years. It whispered on worlds that had never heard the word republic at all. The scale is almost impossible to grasp an expanse of history where entire empires appeared, flourished, and vanished before the first line of the Skywalker saga was ever written. For many, the Old Republic suggests constant war, roaring starships and blazing lightsabers. But tonight, it becomes something else. Instead of frantic heroics, this becomes a calm historical recounting, a measured bedtime chronicle of empires and orders, of quiet councils and distant star systems, turning slowly through the void. What followed was not only battle and betrayal, but treaties, debates, and long, fragile periods of peace that stretched across centuries. These moments of stillness would shape everything that came later. Even when the galaxy forgot their names, the scope of this journey is immense, from the first stirrings of the Jedi on worlds such as Tython to the early meetings between Jedi and a young galactic republic, from the first time hyperspace explorers stitched far-flung systems together to the final fading years when this ancient order of government slowly gave way to a more familiar republic for the next 1,000 years after its peak. The Old Republic would linger in legends and ruins its temples on Coruscant and distant worlds standing as quiet witnesses to forgotten ages. This is the entire Old Republic timeline, followed from its earliest mysteries to its last exhausted moments, the rise of the Jedi as servants of the light side, the birth of the Sith from fallen Jedi who turned to the dark side, the great conflicts that scarred the stars, and the slow rebuilding that always followed. What they found there would change everything whenever explorers charted a new hyperlane or uncovered an ancient world. The map of galactic history shifted just a little more as this chronicle unfolds. The names, dates, and worlds become distant stars in a wide night sky. There is no need to hold on to each one. They can pass softly through the mind and drift away. The Force in this telling is not a storm, but a tide, steady, patient, unhurried. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history in its own way, offering rest instead of urgency, as the Old Republic rises and falls in a calm, unbroken line of memory before the Republic. There was only distance power, slept in scattered worlds that did not yet know one another. Each world stared into its own night sky and imagined itself alone. Some saw the stars as fires of the gods, some as cold jewels scattered across an unreachable dark, others as the eyes of ancient spirits watching in silence on Coruscant, long before it became a galactic capital. Early city, kingdoms rose and fell under smog-choked skies, unaware that thousands of similar struggles played out on far distant horizons on countless worlds. Stone observatories and crude lenses tracked the wandering lights. Priests and scholars argued over patterns in the heavens. Some civilizations mastered electricity and early rocketry. Others remained bound to wind and sail. Each culture carried its own myths of origin and destiny. Entire philosophies formed around constellations that would one day be forgotten. Yet for thousands of years, none of these peoples truly grasped the scale of the galaxy beyond their own clouds. Their stories of creation ended at the edge of visible starlight. Over time, curiosity pressed against that boundary. First came primitive sublight craft, slow-crawling vessels that could take generations to cross the gap between neighboring systems. Crews launched into the dark with no guarantee their descendants would ever see a living world. What followed was a quiet age of lost ships, and unmarked graves in space. A few made it limping into new suns on failing engines, founding tiny pockets of interstellar contact that flickered and faded when their fragile roots broke down. Then in scattered laboratories on distant worlds came the first unstable hyperspace drives. The concept was simple steps sideways into another dimension to shorten the path between stars. The reality was chaos. Early jumps were blind stabs into an unseen ocean. Some ships vanished without a trace. Others reappeared shattered or fused into asteroids. Yet there were those willing to risk everything for the chance to cross the gulf. These first navigators rode the edge between science and faith, trusting instruments. No one fully understood around these bold attempts. Patterns slowly emerged. Explorers marked safe exits from hyperspace with beacons and coded transmissions. Proto-trade lanes formed thin, glowing threads in the dark as freighters followed behind scouts, carrying metals, medicines, and stories. Entire cultures that had once believed themselves unique found neighbors orbiting other suns. Merchants brought tales of alien cities, of oceans under red dwarfs, of gas giants ringed with frozen moons. What they found there would change everything over time. These routes thickened into corridors of travel, and thought-crude star charts evolved into the first shared maps of the galaxy. What began as paths for goods became channels for ideas, philosophies, and early Force traditions, moving from world to world in quiet, unrecorded exchanges. The story of the Old Republic would rise along these same arteries of motion and memory. And among the pilots and mystics who braved the void, some began to sense a presence in the silence between stars, a subtle current binding distant lives. Together a whisper that one day would be named the Force. In time, that whisper drew pilgrims toward a single distant world, a storm-racked planet on the deep rim, where the Force surged in violent tides. Its name was Tython, and for those early travelers, guided by instinct and half-understood visions, what they found there would change everything. Tython was no peaceful sanctuary, its skies split with lightning, its continents shaken by quakes and tempests that seemed to answer the emotions of those who walked its surface. Around these unstable energies gathered scholars, wanderers, and mystics from many cultures. They were not yet Jedi, and there was no republic to sponsor them. There was only curiosity and the quiet certainty that this unseen current binding stars and minds together demanded understanding. They built simple stone enclaves among forests and rocky spires, watching storms roll across the horizon and meditating on the patterns hidden within each flash of light and peal of thunder. The story of these first adepts was not one of strict codes or rigid orders. At first, they approached the Force as a whole, studying calm and fury, healing and destruction with equal attention. Some experimented with channeling the dark side through ritual and emotion. Others surrendered to the light side through contemplation and service. They believed that only by embracing the entire spectrum could true balance be found, and what followed was an era of intense experimentation. Over time, this raw exploration demanded discipline to survive Tython storms and their own inner turmoil. The adepts developed breathing patterns and deep meditations to steady their minds. They crafted force-imbued blades and staves weapons that held energy even without the humming refinement of later lightsabers. In quiet chambers, they began to carve their insights into stone tablets and inscribe them on flexible data scrolls, the first shared texts that would shape later Jedi teachings as their numbers grew. So did tension. Some students felt called to serenity, protection, and the defense of others. For them, the Force was a gentle tide to be guided and aligned. Others were drawn to passion, challenge, and raw power. They argued that the dark side storms of Tython itself proved that conflict was natural and necessary. Debates that began as philosophical soon carried an edge of fear as visions of future war and schism rippled through their meditations around communal fires. And within early temples, the question of balance became impossible to ignore. Should the Force be held in perfect equilibrium, or should one aspect dominate for thousands of years? Echoes of these first arguments would resurface among Jedi and Sith alike. Later centers of learning on Ossus and the towering spires of Coruscant would preserve fragments of Tython's teachings, Though the storms of that ancient world faded into legend, its influence flowed silently beneath every code and creed. Yet on Tython itself, the pressure of opposing visions continued to build, and as the Adepts looked beyond their world toward a growing galactic community, some began to imagine an ordered guardianship, while others saw only change. The first true break was approaching, and the calm before that storm would not last in the wider galaxy. Something quieter than war was beginning to unfold. While Tython wrestled with visions of guardianship, distant explorers traced faint, unstable tunnels through hyperspace. Power was no longer confined to a single world. It could leap between stars in days. The question was simple but immense. When distance stopped being a barrier, what would shape the future? More conflict or cooperation early on? These hyperspace paths were treacherous. Misjumps hurled ships into dead systems or interstellar voids, but over time scouts, prospectors, and daring navigators began to map the safest lines. The Polemian trade route, the Corellian run, and other early corridors turned scattered systems into practical neighbors' worlds that had once felt alone under their own suns, now watched foreign freighters appear in their skies, bearing technology, medicine, and news from impossibly far away. With proximity came tension. Smugglers dodged tariffs, local warlords preyed on merchant convoys, and planetary governments argued over tolls and borders. Yet the same routes that enabled piracy also made shared rules more attractive than isolation. A governor on Coruscant could no longer pretend that a dispute on Alsakan or Corellia was irrelevant when the same ships serviced them. All the story of this period was not a single grand alliance, but hundreds of small, cautious agreements, temporarily at First Worlds, signed narrow pacts. One system promised safe passage in exchange for mutual defense. Another negotiated standardized tariffs to prevent endless economic skirmishes. What followed was a web of treaties so dense that informal councils began to meet neutral stations, hosted mediators, trade guilds lobbied for stability, and diplomats realized that arguing in a chamber was cheaper than fighting in orbit around the galactic core. These habits crystallized on Coruscant. The Ecumenopolis already teemed with species from every direction. Over time, it became the natural crossroads for this experiment in shared governance. Representatives who had once met in ad hoc conferences started to envision something more permanent, a senate, a structured, representative body where countless cultures could debate law, taxation, and collective security instead of testing their fleets. This early galactic republic was less an empire and more a fragile promise. Its charter bound only a fraction of the known galaxy. Vast regions on the rim, in the deep core and beyond, remained independent. Some were ruled by proud, cheap planetary monarchies, others by corporate fiefdoms or criminal syndicates. Entire sectors drifted in near-lawless space where local militias and mercenary bands held more immediate power than any distant Senate decree. Still, the idea mattered. For thousands of years afterward, historians would point to these first senatorial sessions on Coruscant as the moment the galaxy chose to try discussion over domination. Yet even the most eloquent senator understood that words alone could not calm every crisis. Who would mediate when border disputes escalated? Who would stand between feuding systems without serving any one world's ambition? The answer was approaching from Tython, and what they found there would change everything. As the Republic looked outward, its gaze was about to meet the emerging Jedi, and the Senate would soon invite these wanderers of the Force to stand beside it as guardians, mediators, and, in time, something far more complex. The Jedi Republic Alliance, Guardians of Aid, Young Order. As the Republic's scouts pushed further into the core and mid-rim, the dream of a unified galactic community met an older reality. Trade lanes meant profit, and profit meant tension. Worlds argued over tariffs, hyperspace rights, and who controlled newly charted systems. Local security fleets that once chased smugglers now faced private militias and mercenary navies. Entire sectors teetered on the edge of open war. Who could step into these conflicts without becoming another claimant to power? The answer, for a time, was the Jedi. Over time, the wanderers from Tython had begun to crystallize into a true order. They studied the Force, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a current of balance and insight. Their restraint stood in sharp contrast to ambitious senators and corporate magnates. What followed was a quiet invitation. The Republic Senate, overwhelmed by disputes it could no longer arbitrate alone, asked the Jedi to serve as neutral mediators and, when necessary, as defenders of the fragile peace. In the early decades of this alliance, Jedi envoys arrived where negotiations had already failed, on worlds where mining guilds threatened secession. Robed figures stepped between angry delegations and simply asked them to listen on border planets where ancient grudges smoldered. Jedi Knights landed ahead of Republic cruisers, resolving feuds before fleets ever fired a shot. The story of these first missions was not one of glorious war, but of arguments cooled, raids deterred, and treaties signed under the watchful presence of the light side. Symbolically, the partnership became visible in stone and durasteel as much as in policy. The Jedi raised a great temple on Coruscant, not far from the Senate's towering spires. Its ziggurat silhouette became a second skyline, a reminder that beside the elected government stood an older, quieter tradition. Inside, Jedi archivists exchanged information with Republic historians, while in the Senate chambers, robed Jedi representatives began to advise on matters of security, exploration, and the ethical use of emerging technologies. Practically, this alliance extended far beyond debate halls in the Outer Rim. Jedi accompanied Republic task forces against pirates who preyed on new hyperlanes. They boarded rusted frigates with ignited blades, not to slaughter, but to disable and capture whenever possible. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history as entire pirate bands surrendered rather than face annihilation, and some former raiders later served as guides in unexplored regions, turning past violence into new knowledge for the Republic and the Order. For a moment it seemed the galaxy had found a rare equilibrium. The Force-sensitive Guardians and the Senate's elected stewards appeared to move in harmony together. They imagined an era where justice, stability, and measured power would shape the lives of trillions for thousands of years. Yet within the Jedi themselves, not every heart was content with mere mediation. Some knights returned from warlord campaigns convinced that only firmer control could truly end conflict in quiet meditation chambers. Far from the Senate's gaze, a different interpretation of the Force began to whisper of destiny, authority, and the temptation to guide the Republic rather than simply serve it. Whispers of dissent, seeds of the first Dark Jedi. Over time, those quiet reinterpretations of duty and destiny began to crystallize into something more dangerous. The Jedi Order had spread far from Tython and Coruscant into a galactic web of temples and enclaves. Each world brought its own philosophies about power, sacrifice, and justice. In the marble halls of Coruscant, restraint and serenity were praised, yet on harsher frontier worlds. Jedi watched warlords enslave populations and wondered whether the light side truly demanded such distance as the Republic grew. So did the diversity of thought within the Order. Some Jedi trained among warrior cultures that honored passion in battle. Others mediated disputes on worlds where rulers believed that peace came only through absolute control. The story of the early Jedi in this era was not one of perfect unity, but of many voices trying to interpret the same mysterious force. Their codes were the same. Their experiences were not in this tension. A question emerged: if the Force granted power, was it meant only to be obeyed or to be mastered? Some knights, and even a few masters, began to push against strict bans on attachment and emotion. They argued that deep bonds could sharpen resolve rather than corrupt it, that righteous anger at cruelty could fuel decisive action. They saw the dark not as an abyss to be feared, but as a tool to be understood and contained around secluded archives and remote outposts. The line between curiosity and defiance began to blur. Forbidden scrolls on Tython hinted at ancient techniques that bent life and matter through the Force alchemy, that could twist flesh and metal rituals that promised life, extension, or invincible warriors. What followed was a quiet, careful trespass into knowledge the High Council had deliberately sealed away. These were not yet Sith, but they were no longer content with the limits of traditional Jedi teaching. In dimly lit meditation chambers, debates stretched long into artificial night. Some insisted that the Force was to be served in humility. Others whispered that only through firm control could chaos be tamed. They spoke of reshaping worlds, healing entire ecosystems with a gesture or ending conflict by breaking enemy fleets in a single overwhelming strike to them. True peace required strength. Displayed without hesitation, a minority began to train in secret practicing more aggressive forms of telekinesis. Experimenting with battle meditation pushed far beyond accepted boundaries. They tested techniques that drained strength from opponents or bound them in invisible chains. They believed the Jedi had the right, even the duty, to impose order where the Republic faltered for thousands of years later. Their arguments would echo in other dark halls. Whispers of these practices reached the Council in fragments. Reports of unusual wounds on defeated enemies of Jedi, whose presence in battle felt heavy and oppressive, rather than calm, and centering what they found, they would change everything. The Order realized that this was no longer a simple, philosophical disagreement. It was a divergence in the very purpose of the Jedi, and the next attempt to silence it would not end in quiet discussion, but in a war so terrible it would scar the Jedi and the Republic for centuries to come. The 100-Year Darkness, when philosophy became war, around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, that fracture finally broke open. The Jedi Order entered what history would remember as the 100-Year Darkness, a conflict that began as an argument over philosophy and ended as a war of annihilation between those sworn to the same code. The story of this era is not one of invading armies or alien empires, but of the Force itself becoming a battlefield inside the hearts of the Jedi. The origins of the war lay in a faction that refused to turn back. These were Jedi who believed the dark side was not a temptation to be resisted, but a source of untapped power. They delved into forbidden holocrons and ancient rituals. They experimented with Sith alchemy long before a Sith empire existed in the modern sense. On remote worlds and hidden laboratories, they twisted life itself into monstrous creations, war beasts grown for battle and abominations that howled in the Force. Over time, debate on the High Council chambers turned into open defiance. What began as heated arguments over the role of emotion and attachment escalated into schism. Some Jedi abandoned the traditional robes and symbols of the Order. They forged crueler weapons and armor. They trained to break opponents rather than disarm them. When the Council attempted to censure their leaders, the response was not obedience, but rebellion. What followed was the first great internal Jedi war world by world. The conflict spread once peaceful temples became fortresses, their serene meditation gardens scarred into trenches and landing fields. Fleets loyal to each side clashed in the void above neutral systems as worlds chose allegiance or were forced to, by whichever Jedi arrived first on battlefields from Coruscant's lower levels to nameless outer rim moons. Blue and green blades met against the same colors. Jedi fighting Jedi with no Sith banners in sight, only different visions of what the Force should be. The emotional toll was worse than the physical devastation. Masters were forced to raise their sabers against former students who now called themselves Dark Jedi. Entire enclaves vanished when their defenders refused to abandon the heretics and were wiped out in purges that felt more execution than battle. The Order's archives recorded victories, yet every entry read hollow. Each triumph meant another shattered lineage. Another teacher mourning the apprentice they had failed to save after decades of attrition. The Dark Jedi were finally driven back and cornered at the Battle of Korbos. There, their war beasts and alchemical horrors broke against a united Jedi and Republic force. The rebellion collapsed, its leaders captured or slain. The 100-Year Darkness ended, but the wound it left in the Jedi Order would shape its caution and fear of the dark side for thousands of years. Then came the choice that changed everything. Instead of executing the surviving Dark Jedi, the Republic and the Council chose exile. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. Believing banishment safer than martyrdom, they cast the defeated into the unknown regions, unaware that what they found there would change everything again. Mercy in exile, the defeat at Korbos and its consequences. Mercy can end a war. But what happens when mercy is given to those who have already embraced the dark side? The answer is the story of the Dark Jedi at Korbos and the quiet decision that would shape galactic history for thousands of years, around 6,900 years before the Battle of Yavin. The 100-year darkness reached its final, exhausted breath on the barren world of Korbos. The Dark Jedi Rebellion had burned through armies and worlds, but now its last major forces stood cornered against the combined might of the Jedi and the Republic. What followed was not a glorious final charge, but a slow collapse under the weight of attrition, discipline, and superior numbers. Korbos itself reflected the moment, a harsh, rocky world scarred by bombardment and the imprint of the dark side. Its skies were choked with ash, its surface pitted by craters and trenches, where Jedi and Dark Jedi had clashed again and again, as the final battle dragged on the rebels' monstrous creations and twisted warbeasts fell one by one. Their corrupted alchemy no longer enough to turn the tide. When the fighting finally ceased, the outcome was absolute. The Dark Jedi leaders were captured, their followers disarmed, their war machines reduced to wreckage, scattered across the dead plains. Republic soldiers and Jedi healers moved cautiously among the survivors, securing prisoners and tending to the wounded on both sides. The war that had begun as a philosophical schism ended in chains and silence. Many in the Republic expected executions, ancient justice through the blade of a lightsaber, or the cold efficiency of military tribunals. Yet the Jedi Council argued for another path. They believed that killing their fallen brethren would stain the light side and risk turning them into the very monsters they had just defeated. Instead, they proposed banishment, permanent exile beyond known space. The procedure was methodical in its calm cruelty. First, the captured Dark Jedi were stripped of rank and title, their names removed from Jedi records, their achievements erased, as if the Order itself were closing a book. Next came the confiscation of weapons and artifacts. Lightsabers, talismans, and dark side relics were collected and sealed away, so that no trace of their power would travel with the exiles. Unarmed starships were prepared in orbit, simple transports without hyperweaponry or escorts. Each prisoner group was loaded aboard under heavy guard restraints, humming softly in the quiet hangars. Navigation officers entered distant, uncharted coordinates into their systems, points far beyond the mapped lanes of the Republic, then locked the controls so that only the automated guidance could complete the journey to the Jedi and the Republic. This was meant as a statement exile instead of execution, mercy instead of vengeance. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. They believed isolation would end the threat without further bloodshed, that over time the Dark Jedi would fade into obscurity on some forgotten rock in the void. But those ships did not vanish into nothingness. Cast into the unknown regions, they drifted toward worlds the Republic had never charted, and what they found there would change everything. Waiting in that darkness was a species already steeped in the dark side, and the first foundations of a new empire. Korriban discovered Dark Jedi. Meet the Sith species. Cast into the unknown regions, the Dark Jedi exiles drifted in damaged ships. Their hyperdrives burned out their supplies, dwindling around them. The stars stretched cold and in different days blurred into weeks as their flotilla fell deeper into uncharted space, guided only by crude sensors and the faint pull of the dark side. The Republic believed them gone forever, but the Force had other plans. Eventually, the currents of space brought them to a barren red world, its presence pressing against their minds like a whispered promise of power. This world would be known as Korriban from orbit. It appeared harsh and lifeless, jagged mountain ranges cutting across rust-colored deserts, yet beneath its silence the planet seethed with dark side energy, ancient and oppressive as the exiles descended. Their ships shuddered in the turbulent atmosphere. The Force itself seemed to thicken around them, amplifying rage, hatred, and ambition. What followed was a rough landing, scattered across rocky valleys and dust-choked plateaus. The fallen Jedi staggered from their vessels, exhausted, wounded, but still immensely dangerous. They were not alone. Korriban was home to the Sith species, a red-skinned people, with bony facial ridges and fleshy tendrils hanging from their cheeks and chins. Their eyes burned a deep yellow or amber hardened by generations of struggle. In a brutal environment, the Sith lived in rigid city-states, ruled by priest-kings, whose authority flowed from a theocratic tradition. Their temples were carved into cliffs and canyon walls, decorated with jagged obelisks and blood-red sigils. Each city revolved around dark rituals, ancestor worship, and bloodline rule. They did not know the Jedi, but they knew the dark side first. Contact came when patrols of Sith warriors and priests converged on the crash sites. To the natives, the arrival of starships tearing fire across the sky resembled prophecy. The exiles emerged cloaked in torn robes, wielding blades and the Force, with a precision the local sorcerers had never imagined. When one dark Jedi casually hurled a boulder aside with a gesture or choked a charging beast in midair, the Sith priests fell to their knees, interpreting these displays as proof that gods or divine heralds had descended. The story of their people had just collided with a far older galactic conflict. The power dynamic shifted almost immediately. The Dark Jedi recognized a culture already comfortable with sacrifice, domination, and fear. They saw not equals but material, a ready-made foundation for an empire. They presented themselves as lords and saviors, promising greater mastery of the dark. In exchange for loyalty over time, they reshaped Sith religion, adding concepts of the Force and structured training, twisting native rites into more efficient tools of control. Bloodlines were bred together. Dark Jedi, taking Sith mates, creating hybrids whose strength would shape history for thousands of years on this lonely world. A new identity began to form, neither purely Jedi nor purely Sith species, but something more dangerous. And as the first of these Dark Lords looked beyond Korriban's red horizon, they began to dream of conquest. Once again, a dream that in the next era would finally reach the wider galaxy. From Dark Jedi to Sith Lords, forging a new order on Korriban. The dream of conquest needed. A name power always seeks a banner and a title. But what happens when that title is taken from an ancient people, already steeped in the dark side? The answer is the birth of the Sith, as more than a species, as the story of a new order. In the early years, the human exiles still thought of themselves as former Jedi warriors and warlords, yet ruling over the native red-skinned population required more than raw force power. It required legitimacy. So they took the word Sith, which had once described only the indigenous people, and turned it into a mark of rulership. The greatest of the exiles became Lords of the Sith, their authority resting on conquest, sorcery, and fear over time. That title began to shift. At first, it meant master over the Sith species. Then it became a religious and political identity. Those who embraced the dark side creed of passion and domination called themselves Scythe. Regardless of blood, this subtle change in language would shape the entire empire. It allowed conquered subjects, ambitious priests, and gifted warriors to dream of rising beyond their birth. Meanwhile, another slower transformation was underway. Intermarriage between the human exiles and the native Sith became common among the ruling class. Some unions were political alliances, others were carefully arranged for their Force potential. Selective breeding created hybrid bloodlines, tall imposing figures with the crimson or copper skin of the Sith and the sharper features of humans. Their glowing yellow eyes and cranial bone spurs became living symbols of authority. These hybrids claimed 3 pillars of power. They carried the Force sensitivity of the exiled Jedi, the ancestral reverence of the Sith species, and the political control of an emerging empire. What followed was a fusion of cult and court, where genealogy scrolls mattered as much as holocrons, and where a child's bloodline could determine access to forbidden teachings. As this new aristocracy solidified, so did its hierarchy. At the apex stood a single Dark Lord of the Sith, the supreme master of the dark side. Beneath this figure clustered rival Sith Lords, each ruling territories, temples, and armies. They in turn commanded priestly castes who guarded esoteric rituals, warrior legions bred for conflict, and vast populations of slaves mining crystals, building tombs, and feeding the endless machinery of empire. The language of identity completed the break from the Jedi once fallen Jedi. The exiles now rejected that label entirely. They were not failed servants of the light side, but chosen heirs of a harsher truth. Sith Lords with a destiny of conquest for thousands of years. This mindset would drive every war, every betrayal, every grand design. Then a quiet shift, a pattern interrupt in their own thinking. Hidden beyond the Republic's reach, this new Sith Empire began to grow, not only in armies and fleets, but in philosophy and hatred. Ancient resentments toward the Jedi who had cast them out hardened into doctrine, and as their rituals deepened and their tomb worlds multiplied, the stage was set for the moment when their isolation would end and the wider galactic order would finally feel their return. The first Sith Empire. Capitals, councils, and creeds hidden beyond the Republic's reach, this new Sith Empire settled into a rhythm of rule and ritual, but in the shadows of its worlds, the true heart of its power beat. Upon a single, desolate planet, power can be measured in fleets and armies. Yet what happens when that power is rooted in graves and ghosts? The answer is Korriban. On Korriban, the story of the Sith became carved into stone. The planet was a wasteland of red deserts, jagged canyons, and howling winds. Yet beneath that harsh surface lay colossal tombs hewn directly into the rock faces. Each mausoleum honored an ancient Dark Lord, their sarcophagi surrounded by statues and engraved with accounts of conquest and sorcery. Over time, the dark side saturated the very air of the world. The spirits of long-dead rulers lingered in the halls, whispering secrets to those strong enough to endure their presence for thousands of years. Korriban served as the spiritual heart of the Empire. Pilgrims and acolytes arrived to undergo trials in the Valley of the Dark Lords, walking between towering statues that seemed almost alive with malice. Their apprentices faced illusions and phantoms manifestations of the dark side that tested fear, ambition, and cruelty. Only those who embraced conflict within themselves were deemed worthy to enter the deeper catacombs where holocrons and relics promised greater power. Yet an empire could not be governed from a graveyard, so the Sith chose another world as their colder mind, Zeost, orbiting a dimmer star. Zeost was a harsher, more temperate planet covered in dark forests and black stone cities. There, the Sith built their primary capital, a labyrinth of citadels, administrative complexes, and military bastions from this world. The Dark Lord ruled, convening councils, issuing decrees, and directing fleets. Zeost housed academies, where instructors drilled doctrine into new generations, teaching that mercy was weakness, and that the Force existed to be bent to the will of the strong. At the core of this doctrine lay a single belief: conflict was the refining fire through struggle, competition, and pain. The Sith believed that true strength would emerge, and all weakness would be purged. Apprentices were encouraged to challenge masters' rivals, plotted against one another, and even among the highest ranks, respect was always edged with fear. What followed was an endless cycle of tests, betrayals, and duels that the Sith claimed kept their empire from decay. Above this seething mass stood the Dark Lord of the Sith, presiding over a council of rival Sith Lords. Each Lord ruled sectors of space, commanding armies and enslaved populations. Their loyalty was pledged upward, but their ambition always pushed outward. Assassinations were not uncommon. A poison cup, a sabotage shuttle, a sudden lightsaber in the dark. Yet as long as the Empire expanded, such violence was tolerated, even expected. During these centuries, the Sith Empire grew quietly into neighboring sectors, its fleets constructed in hidden shipyards, its slave populations drawn from conquered worlds unknown to the distant Republic. This expansion remained a rumor at best, a phantom on the edge of galactic awareness. And for the next 1,000 years, the Sith were content to sharpen their blades in secret, preparing for the day when isolation would end and their dark banners would finally emerge from the shadows. Life under the Sith, architecture, slavery, and everyday fear. In those hidden centuries, the Sith Empire did more than sharpen its blades. It built entire worlds into monuments of domination power, expressed not only in fleets and armies, but in stone, metal, and light. Their great cities rose from jungles, frozen plains, and storm-racked coasts as jagged silhouettes against a permanent Twilight Sith architecture asked a simple question: what happens when a civilization designs every structure to remind its citizens of their insignificance? The answer stood in the form of looming angular skylines, towering spires of obsidian and basalt, thrust upward in harsh geometric lines. Narrow bridges spanned impossible heights, with no railings. Vast plazas opened beneath blood-red sky shields, bathing everything in a constant, low crimson glow. The story of the Sith was written into these constructions. Every corridor funneled crowds toward choke points, every doorway overshadowed by carved visages of ancient Dark Lords. At the heart of many of these cities stood the academies, places where acolytes were stripped down and rebuilt as instruments of the dark side, on Korriban Dromund Kars and lesser fortress worlds. These institutions combined brutal military college with occult monastery stone training yards echoed with the clash of blades and the crackle of force lightning, while underground chambers housed libraries of forbidden texts and alchemical laboratories. What followed was a lifetime of trials, duels, and psychological torment. Only the most ruthless survived. Surrounding the academies were barracks and garrisons where soldiers and officers were drilled into absolute obedience. Commanders were taught to fear their Sith overseers more than any enemy. Failure on the battlefield did not mean reassignment. It meant execution in a public square, beneath those same crimson lights. Nearby temples completed the triad, towering ziggurats and pyramids where rituals and sacrifices were performed. Their inner walls lined with channels to conduct blood and energy into focusing chambers that pulsed faintly with dark power over time. This physical environment reinforced a rigid social hierarchy. At the pinnacle stood the Dark Council and rival Sith Lords. Beneath them, a narrow stratum of overseers, Moff's intelligence directors, and cult priests interpreted commands and enforced doctrine. Below that, vast layers of slaves and laborers mined, forged, and built the Empire's war machine. Entire populations from conquered systems were shipped to foundries on Dromund Kars or refineries in the Stygian caldera. Their lives measured only in quotas met and structures completed. In such a society, fear was not an accident. It was a tool. Even minor officials lived in constant anxiety, watching rivals, colleagues, and subordinates for any sign of betrayal. Common citizens learned unspoken rules: never speak a Sith Lord's name aloud, never run in the streets, never stare at a passing speeder. Convoy too long. Ambition and terror intertwined. Every promotion hinted at power, but also painted a target on the recipient's back. Darkside sorcery was not confined to secret chambers. It permeated governance, warfare, and even the buildings themselves. Alchemical treatments hardened armor and starship hulls. Sith battle meditations guided fleets through hyperspace storms. Runic pylons anchored city shields by channeling the Force through bound spirits. For thousands of years, this saturation of the dark side created an almost physical pressure in the air, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that would shape every conflict to come. And soon that pressure would explode outward into the wider galactic stage. Lords of Legend, Ajunta Pal, Marka Ragnos, and the early Titans, in that pressure cooker of dark energy, certain. Names rose above all others, names that turned the abstract weight of the dark side into living. Well, the story of the early Sith Empire is not only about armies and temples, it is about figures whose choices would shape Sith identity for thousands of years. Among the first was Ajunta Pal, one of the defeated Dark Jedi, cast out after the 100-year darkness, driven from the Republic and the Jedi Order. He carried not just bitterness, but a relentless hunger for forbidden knowledge on Korriban and Zeost. That hunger found a home. Pal embraced the Sith species, conquered them, and in doing so, became one of the first true Dark Lords of the Sith. Pal's genius expressed itself not only in battle but in the workshop. His domain was Sith alchemy, the art of twisting matter and life through the Force. He forged blades infused with corruption weapons that whispered to those who held them, promising power at the cost of slowly eroding sanity. One such sword would survive long after his bones turned to dust, a cursed relic discovered in forgotten tombs and studied at great risk by later Sith and Jedi scholars. Over time, Ajunta Pal's story blurred at the edges, fact and legend mixing in the red sands of Korriban. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage for apprentices, seeking secrets carved into stone walls and hidden in lingering echoes of his presence. They came to understand a core Sith belief. Knowledge is power, and any knowledge powerful enough is worth any price, even one paid in blood or in the loss of self centuries past. And the Empire hardened under the rule of many Dark Lords until one name towered above the rest. Marka Ragnos, around 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. His reign marked the height of the Sith. Golden Age. Ragnos was a warrior priest of the dark side whose personal strength silenced rivals before they could become open threats. His mere existence kept the Empire from tearing itself apart. Yet his power was not only physical. Ragnos understood politics as another battlefield. He played ambitious Sith against one another, never allowing any faction to grow strong enough to challenge him. What followed was a long era of brutal stability, a balance maintained not by peace, but by fear. Under his rule, the Sith Empire consolidated wealth-trained legions and waited in the shadows of the galactic rim. When Ragnos finally died, the reaction revealed how mythic he had become. His burial on Korriban was not a simple funeral. It was a ritual assertion of Sith destiny. His monumental tomb joined those of earlier Titans, turning the Valley of the Dark Lords into a physical map of Sith history and ambition. Spirits, lingered artifacts, pulsed with trapped hatred, and for the next 1,000 years, acolytes braved those halls, seeking shortcuts to greatness in Ajunta Pal. The Sith revered experimentation and the mastery of forbidden arts in Marka Ragnos. They exalted raw authority and the right of the strongest to rule. Together, these traits defined a culture where legacy itself became a weapon. Tombs and relics extended a Dark Lord's influence far beyond death, a twisted form of immortality achieved through fear, remembrance, and the constant temptation of their surviving works. But such carefully restrained violence could not remain contained forever. The moment Ragnos's grip faded, old rivalries erupted into open conflict. Contenders such as Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh stepped forward, guided by visions of galactic conquest. The hidden empire was about to step out of the shadows, and the Republic that once exiled the Dark Jedi was about to discover that its forgotten enemies had not been idle. The Great Hyperspace War, Naga Sado, Ludo Kresh, and first contact with Marka Ragnos, gone the fragile balance that had held the hidden Sith Empire together, finally shattered power, hung in the air over Korriban, heavier than the dust of 1,000 tombs who would claim the mantle of Dark Lord and decide the Empire's future. The answer was a deadly rivalry between two Sith Lords whose visions could not be reconciled. Naga Sado dreamed of expansion. He believed the Sith had grown stagnant, buried in ritual and ancestral worship. His answer was conquest, to unleash the dark side beyond the old borders and challenge the distant Republic. Ludo Kresh, in contrast, clung to caution. He saw strength in isolation, in guarding the ancient worlds and preserving what Ragnos had built for thousands of years. This tension between aggression and defense had simmered beneath the surface. Now it erupted into open conflict, at the same time far from Korriban. The Republic continued its age of exploration. Hyperspace scouts traced new routes across the galactic rim. One such expedition, led by Gav and Jory Darrigan, stumbled into the very heart of Sith space. They were fleeing Predators and danger on Koros Major, when a risky hyperspace jump hurled their ship to an uncharted red world. What they found there would change everything. That world was Korriban, the sacred burial ground of the Sith. The sight of off-worlders trespassing among the tombs stunned the Sith Council. To Sado, this was no accident, but an opportunity. He argued that the Republic had finally come to finish what the ancient Jedi had started. Kresh insisted the intruders should be quietly eliminated and the Empire remain hidden. Sado instead orchestrated a far more ambitious deception. He arranged a daring prison break for the captured Darragons, then secretly attacked Sith space with his own forces, disguising them as Republic assailants. What followed was a spiral of manufactured outrage. Sado's agents struck at key targets. He used Sith sorcery and illusions to make the attacks appear far larger than they were. The narrative was simple and powerful. The Republic had discovered the Sith and would soon invade, unless the Sith struck first, rallying the Empire behind this vision of righteous preemptive war. Sado seized the title of Dark Lord, his fleets poured into newly forged hyperspace routes created with the Darrigan stolen charts. Sith warships emerged over unsuspecting Republic worlds. Entire systems were thrown into panic. Coruscant itself came under attack as Sith forces descended on the galactic capital. For a brief moment, it seemed the Republic might fall to an enemy it had forgotten even existed. Yet Saddo's grand design contained the seed of its own failure. Internal Sith betrayal and the resilience of the Jedi turned the tide. Ludo Kresh rose against Saddo. Their clash fractured Sith unity at the very moment unity was most needed. The Republic pushed back, system by system, until Saddo's forces collapsed, retreating into the depths of space. Korriban fell. Its temples shattered its empire, seemingly broken. The Republic, believing the Sith threat ended, chose to advance into former Sith territory. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. For the next 1,000 years, the galaxy would live with the consequences of that assumption. Ashes. Empire. Aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War. The Republic's advance into Sith space began not with celebration, but with silence. Power had shifted, yet the stars themselves felt wounded. Whole sectors lay dimmed by the memory of war. What followed was a slow, unsettling realization that victory over the Sith had not brought peace, only questions. In the months after the Great Hyperspace War, Republic scouts and Jedi survey teams moved cautiously through former Sith territory, around Korriban Ziost and other once-hidden worlds. They found shattered fleets drifting in cold orbits, hulks of crimson warships pitted by turbo laser fire and cracked by failed hyperspace jumps on the surface of Sith worlds. Blackened cities lay half-buried in ash temples, split open by orbital bombardment, exposed vast underground crypts where the dark side had pooled for thousands of years. What they found there would change everything. Sealed tombs had been broken in panic. Ancient statues lay toppled and scorched as if the Sith themselves had turned their weapons inward in their final hours. In some places, entire populations were gone, not merely killed, but vanished, leaving only scorched foundations and residual echoes in the Force. The story of this fallen empire was written in ruins, and in the uneasy stillness that followed its collapse, the Republic's Senate confronted an unprecedented problem: how to manage territories it had never known existed. Only months before, the solution was methodical, but imperfect. Military governors were installed on key worlds. Garrisons raised prefabricated bases placed atop former Sith strongholds in an attempt to project stability. Trade lanes were charted through once forbidden hyperspace corridors, and some surviving local populations were granted representation under Republic law, at least on paper, over time. These efforts would shape border regions where Republic customs clashed with lingering Sith culture. On certain worlds, statues of Jedi heroes stood awkwardly beside scarred obelisks bearing the names of long-dead Dark Lords. Yet beneath this thin layer of administration, the scars of war and conquest remained raw and unresolved. Not every Sith had perished in the firestorms. As Republic task forces advanced deeper, they found evidence of hurried evacuations, empty hangars, scorched launch pads, and partial star charts pointing further into the unknown regions. Many Sith Lords, warship crews, and acolytes had fled into deeper, uncharted space. They carried with them holocrons, ritual texts, weapons, and above all, grudges. Hidden enclaves formed around surviving masters, preserving Sith teachings in secret sanctuaries far beyond the reach of Coruscant for the Jedi. The psychological impact was profound. The Order had always known the dark side as a personal temptation, but the Great Hyperspace War revealed that an entire empire could grow in darkness beyond their awareness. The Council became more vigilant, more suspicious of unexplored space and unexplained disturbances in the Force. Some within the Republic adopted harsher security measures, arguing that mercy toward defeated enemies had nearly doomed the galaxy. Yet even as the Republic declared the Sith extinct, the currents of the dark side did not fade. They merely sank deeper beneath galactic history. Waiting, the assumption that this empire had been destroyed forever would shape decisions for the next 1,000 years, setting the stage for new Sith orders to rise in moments when the Republic once again felt safest and least prepared. quiet centuries and growing cracks. The Republic between wars. The Republic's belief that the Sith Empire had been erased created a strange calm in the centuries that followed in the absence of a visible, dark enemy. The galaxy turned inward instead of vast crusades and apocalyptic rituals. There were trade routes, surveys, and senatorial debate. What followed was a long stretch of relative peace, in which the old Republic expanded further than it ever had. Before, in the centuries after the Great Hyperspace War, new hyperlanes were charted to the Rim. Territories' worlds that had once been frontier outposts became full members of the Republic. Standardized laws spread from Coruscant outward, unifying currencies, courts, and commercial codes across thousands of systems. Great trade spines, such as the Hydian Way and the Corellian Run, carried goods and people at a scale unseen in earlier eras. For many citizens, this was the story of stability, a sense that the great galactic conflicts were finally behind them over time. That same stability began to harden into something heavier. The Senate swelled with delegates and committees, each new sector representation bringing more procedure, more regulation, and more delay. Bureaucracy thickened around every decision. Regional governors learned how to hide favors and bribes inside layers of legal language. Some core worlds prospered under these rules, but distant systems on the Rim felt their resources taxed, and their pleas ignored. Mining colonies complained of unsafe conditions. Agricultural worlds faced predatory contracts enforced by remote courts. The promise of unity slowly blurred into a feeling of exploitation during this era. The Jedi Order also changed, with no galaxy-spanning Sith Empire. To confront the Jedi focused on quieter work mediation of trade disputes, investigation of local crime syndicates, and the settling of border skirmishes between minor planetary powers. Temples on Coruscant and Ossus deepened their archives and training programs. Jedi scholars debated the nature of the Force, while watchmen on remote worlds served as calm guardians rather than wartime generals without existential tests to challenge them. Their methods and doctrines ossified. They grew very good at preserving peace as they understood it, but less prepared for powers that did not follow familiar patterns in the spaces beyond the main hyperlanes. However, new regional powers were taking shape. Warrior cultures on worlds such as Mandalore watched the softening Republic, with interest clans forged around honor duels and conquest refine their armor and weapons into terrifying instruments of war. Beskar Plate turned individual soldiers into walking fortresses. Their fleets learned to strike swiftly along the same trade routes that had made the Republic rich for thousands of years. To those warriors, the prosperous core looked vulnerable, not invincible. For the next 1,000 years, the assumption that peace would simply continue guided many senatorial choices, but peace without vigilance can invite predators. The Mandalorian clans began to test the borders, raiding outposts and probing defenses. What they found there would change everything. They discovered a Republic slow to react, and Jedi accustomed to limited interventions. The next great challenge to the old Republic would not first wear the robes of the Sith. It would come in armored ranks from the outer rim, marching toward a war the Republic did not yet believe was possible. The Mandalorian Crusades. Warriors testing a tired Republic in the outer rim. The armored warriors who had tested the borders now gathered in greater numbers. Their culture was built on conflict. But what happens when a society measures worth only through war? The answer is the Mandalorians, a people for whom battle was not a tragedy, but a proving ground. The story of the Mandalorians stretches back centuries before these events forged in harsh worlds where only strength and unity could ensure survival. They wrapped themselves in Beskar armor and in codes of honor. Clans competed for glory under a single Mandalore each duel. Each campaign was a test of personal power and of a clan's right to lead for thousands of years. This warrior creed simmered at the edge of galactic affairs, waiting for moments of weakness. Around the time the Republic grew tired and complacent, a new movement rose among them, the Neo-Crusaders. Under a charismatic Mandalore they imposed discipline on the old raiding traditions, standardizing armor and tactics, turning scattered warbands into an organized war machine. What followed was a series of deliberate campaigns, not mere piracy. They struck at border worlds along the outer rim and mid-rim, carefully measuring how fast the Republic could respond. The answer was unsettlingly slow. Senate committees debated jurisdiction, while colonies burned fleets, were understrength scattered across trade routes, and still recovering from earlier conflicts in some sectors. By the time a task force arrived, the battle was already over. Cities were glassed, spaceports shattered, populations scattered or enslaved. Entire worlds were not always conquered. Sometimes they were simply broken as a message over time patterns emerged. Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders would hit one system hard, then vanish into the void, only to reappear dozens of light years away. Their armored ranks advanced behind heavy shields, and basilisk war droids hurling themselves directly into the strongest defenses, as if daring the Republic to answer in kind. This was not random brutality, it was a systematic test of the Republic's capacity for war on Coruscant. The Jedi Council watched these developments with growing concern, yet the memory of past disasters hung over every discussion. The 100-year darkness and the rise of the Sith had shown what happened when Force users turned large-scale conflict into a personal arena. The Council feared that a Jedi-led crusade would feed the dark side on a galactic scale, transforming a border war into a spiritual catastrophe. So the Order chose restraint. Jedi were dispatched as advisors, mediators, and limited defenders, but not as generals of a holy war. This caution was meant as wisdom, a barrier against repeating ancient mistakes. However, among the younger Jedi Knights, a different judgment formed in quiet corridors and whispered debates. The Mandalorian advance looked less like a distant problem and more like a moral failure. One brilliant knight, in particular, studied the reports of ruined worlds and delayed responses. His name was Revan, and to him the Council's caution did not look like balance. It looked like abandonment. The tension between that conviction and the Order's restraint would shape everything that came next. Revan and Malak, heroes, step into the fire. Power can be patient and distant, or it can step into the fire and refuse to look away from suffering. The Jedi Council chose distance during the Mandalorian Wars. Revan chose the fire. The story of his rise begins with reports that read, more like nightmares than military briefings. From the Outer Rim came images of glassed cities and shattered moons. Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, burning worlds in the name of honor and conquest. Among the Jedi who studied those reports, Revan stood out, a brilliant knight with a gift for strategy and a presence in the Force that drew others to him. At his side was Ulic, later known as Malak, taller, louder, a formidable, a warrior who believed utterly in his friend's judgment. Together, they watched the conflict spread and felt the Order's inaction as a wound over time. Their frustration hardened into resolve. The Council urged patience, argued that the Mandalorians might be testing the Republic for weaknesses, that unseen Sith might be waiting in the shadows. Revan saw only worlds dying, while the Guardians of Peace debated. He began to speak in quiet halls and war rooms, asking a simple question. If the Jedi would not act, who would answer? Was a growing chorus of Knights Healers and pilots who could no longer endure the waiting around this moment. An unofficial intervention force began to coalesce. Revan and Malak moved from system to system, rallying volunteers from the Republic military and disaffected Jedi. They wore no formal new insignia, yet their ships started to travel in coordinated formations. Their task forces answered pleas for help. The Council refused. What followed was a slow but undeniable shift in the war's momentum. The Mandalorians, who had expected scattered resistance, now faced a mind that could see entire campaigns, several moves ahead. Revan's tactics broke with traditional Jedi restraint. He used daring hyperspace maneuvers to appear behind Mandalorian lines, striking command ships and fuel depots before vanishing again. He targeted supply routes and staging grounds rather than chasing glory on the front lines. In one campaign, his fleets feigned retreat, only to re-emerge from an unexpected vector and annihilate a Crusader armada above a vital shipyard. These victories earned him admiration across the Republic, to soldiers and citizens. He looked less like a rebellious knight and more like a savior. But the cost of that effectiveness grew steadily darker. Each success seemed to demand a harsher choice. Revan authorized planetary bombardments to eliminate entrenched Mandalorian positions, knowing civilians would die. He ordered blockades that starved entire sectors to deny the enemy. Resources Malak enforced those decisions with brutal efficiency, and many under their command began to echo their logic. If ending the war quickly required terrible acts, then those acts became not only acceptable, but necessary. By the time the conflict neared its climax, Revan's followers were bound to him more than to the Council. The line between light side discipline and dark side expedience blurred in the glow of constant battle. Driven by intelligence reports and half-glimpsed visions, he turned his gaze toward the unknown regions, certain that the true source of the Mandalorian threat lay beyond the mapped galaxy. He led a chosen fleet into that darkness. What they found there would change everything. It would shape his transformation from celebrated defender of the Republic into something far more ominous, and the Jedi Civil War waited just beyond that horizon. The turning of Revan, unknown regions, and a hidden Sith Empire cast into the unknown regions. Revan's expedition moved beyond charts and patrol routes into a silence even the Force seemed reluctant to touch. Victory at Malak 5 had ended the Mandalorian Wars, but it had also torn something open. The mass shadow generator had crushed fleets into the planet's gravity well, turning Malak into a wound in space, a scar of twisted metal and petrified screams. That final act of power ended one war. It began another. In the aftermath, questions remained. The Mandalorians had fought with unfamiliar tactics, wielding strange metals and shield systems that did not match known suppliers. Where had this sudden strength come from? Revan followed fragments of intercepted transmissions, half-burned star charts, and ancient Rakatan coordinates recovered from devastated worlds. Over time, those clues pointed in one direction, toward a deeper darkness beyond the edge of galactic history. What followed was a descent through forgotten systems and dead hyperlanes, past derelict stations that still echoed with distant, wordless fear. On worlds long abandoned, Revan and Malak uncovered temples that predated the Republic, vaults inscribed with Sith runes, and holocrons whispering of a hidden master. Piece by piece, the story of an unseen empire emerged, one that had never fallen at Coruscant or been recorded in Jedi archives. In the cold heart of that frontier, they finally found it. The true Sith Empire, rebuilt in secret after the Great Hyperspace War, ruled from Droman Khas by an emperor who had survived for thousands of years through rituals of the dark side. His will saturated the storm-racked skies and the very stone of his citadel. This was not the fractured warlordism of Naga Sado's heirs, but a patient, predatory power waiting for the Republic to forget. Revan and Malak were brought before this emperor as conquerors, then stripped down to supplicants. Through domination in the Force, through visions and agonizing mental assaults, their convictions were broken and reforged. Their hatred for the Mandalorians was turned into contempt for the Republic that had hesitated, the Jedi that had doubted. Their brilliance became a weapon in another's hand. Under his influence, their memories blurred, their loyalties twisted until the light side felt distant and unreal. When they emerged, they were no longer simply Revan and Malak. They were Darth Revan and Darth Malak, Sith Lords bearing secret commands and a mandate to prepare the galaxy for invasion. They returned to known space with new fleets, hidden shipyards, and knowledge of ancient superweapons, including the path to an immense Rakatan forge world that could feed an endless war. Their crusade against the Republic was not a rebellion. It was the opening move of a far greater design. As their banners appeared on the rim and systems began to fall, few understood that behind their betrayal stood an empire still waiting in the dark. The next phase of galactic conflict had begun, and the Jedi Civil War was only the surface of something far more terrifying that had yet to reveal itself. The Jedi Civil War, Starforge, betrayal, and a broken galaxy. In the quiet that followed the Mandalorian Wars, the Republic expected exhaustion and slow recovery. Instead, what followed was a new storm born from its own defenders. Revan and Malak returned not as saviors, but as Sith Lords armed with intimate knowledge of the Republic's strengths and weaknesses. Their war would not be chaotic. It would be terrifyingly efficient around 3,960 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Jedi Civil War erupted, Revan's fleets did not strike at random. He understood established hyperspace routes, supply lines, and the standard playbook of Republic admirals. He anticipated how they would retreat, where they would regroup, and which worlds they could not afford to lose. His forces cut through key junctions along the Hydian Way and Perlemian routes, isolating sectors, before the Republic fully understood the scale of the conflict. This precision was not only tactical, it was industrial. Behind Revan's sudden surge in power stood an ancient weapon from a far older empire, the Starforge, hidden in orbit, above the radiation-scarred star of the Lehon system. This vast Rakatan space station drew on stellar energy and the dark side to manufacture warships, starfighters, and droids without rest. What they found there would change everything. The Forge turned Revan's Sith armada into a self-sustaining machine, able to replace losses faster than the Republic could count them. Over time, the strain on the Jedi Order became unbearable. Some knights, seeing only stagnation in the Council and decisive strength in Revan, crossed the line and swore themselves to his banner. Others, disillusioned by endless war, simply vanished into the Outer Rim, refusing to fight at all. Many more died in brutal engagements above core worlds and remote colonies. Entire generations of Jedi were burned away in battles over worlds whose names would fade from galactic memory as Revan's legend grew. So did Malak's resentment. He was the loyal apprentice, the blunt instrument who shattered worlds, while his master played the strategist when a group of Jedi led by Bastila Shan finally cornered Revan's flagship. Malak saw an opening that the dark side whispered he should not ignore. During the ambush, he ordered his own guns to fire on Revan's command ship, intending to annihilate both the Jedi strike team and his master in a single treacherous volley. This was the moment the war's center of gravity shifted. Revan vanished. Malak crowned himself Dark Lord and unleashed a cruder campaign of terror, yet Revan did not die. The Jedi recovered the broken Sith Lord from the wreckage and made a choice that would shape everything that followed. They used the Force to strip away his memories, reshaping his identity and turning their greatest enemy into an unwitting servant. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history as the amnesiac Revan began a slow path toward the light side and toward a redemption that might one day begin to heal the wounds his own war had carved across the stars. Revan's redemption and the slow rebuilding of the Republic power can be taken by force or given by trust. But what happens when that trust is built on a lie? The answer is the story of Revan's redemption, a tale in which the Jedi try to heal a galactic wound by reshaping the very mind that had helped tear it open in the quiet chambers of the Jedi Council. On Dantooine, the fallen Dark Lord lay broken after Malik's betrayal. The Masters sensed a narrow path between justice and necessity. They chose it without hesitation. Rather than execute Revan, they used the Force to strip away his memories. They implanted a new identity, loyal to the Republic and bound to a single handler, Bastila Shan. What followed was an unprecedented experiment, turning the architect of the Jedi Civil War into a weapon against his former apprentice around this time. The galaxy itself seemed exhausted. Major trade routes lay in ruins. Key shipyards were occupied or destroyed, and whole sectors drifted without stable government into this fractured landscape. Revan awoke as a simple Republic soldier, unaware that his mind once commanded fleets over time. Every new world he visited chipped away at the illusion. Taris with its desperate refugees, Dantooine with its calm Jedi enclave, Tatooine's harsh deserts, and Kashyyyk's shadowed forests, each offered fragments of a past he could feel, but not name. As his companions gathered around him, they became living mirrors of who he had been. Candorous awe, Doe remembered the ruthless strategist who had broken the Mandalorian's mission. Logs and holocrons whispered of a Jedi Knight who had walked willingly into the dark side. Even HK-47, the assassin droid, spoke fondly of efficient massacres conducted in his master's name. Yet in battle after battle, Revan now chose restraint, mercy, and careful planning. He was not ordered to reject the Sith. He arrived at that decision slowly, painfully, and of his own free will. The path led inexorably to the Starforge, an ancient Rakatan factory suspended over a dying star. What they found there would change everything. The station drew power directly from the dark side, and from the star itself, birthing endless fleets for Malak's Sith Empire. In the final confrontation, amidst corridors lit by molten light, Revan faced the apprentice who had betrayed him. Their duel was more than personal vengeance. It was the closing act of a war that had cost billions of lives when Malak fell. The Starforge was either destroyed or seized by the Republic. In both outcomes, its production ended and the Sith war machine finally broke. In the years that followed, the Republic entered a fragile recovery. Devastated fleets limped back to dry docks. Depopulated worlds begged for aid, while worlds spared from battle argued over who would pay the cost. The Jedi Order, haunted by its failures, stood. Diminished in numbers and confidence, many masters retreated into meditation, searching the Force for answers they had once believed they already possessed. Yet, in the shadows of this uneasy peace, old darkness lingered. Scattered Sith warlords clung to hidden strongholds, and beyond known space, the distant true Sith Empire watched in silence. For the next 1,000 years, the consequences of Revan's choices would shape every major conflict, even as the Republic convinced itself that the worst was finally over. The Dark Wars begin. Nihilus, Scion, and the shadow of extinction. Yet, in the shadows of this uneasy peace, old darkness lingered. Scattered Sith warlords clung to hidden strongholds and beyond known space. The distant true Sith Empire watched in silence. The galaxy exhaled after the Jedi Civil War, believing the storm had passed. But what happens when a forest survives the fire, only to rot from within? The answer is the next chapter in the story of the Old Republic, the era remembered as the Dark Wars. In the years that followed Revan's redemption, the Jedi Order stood hollowed out. Its temples damaged, its archives incomplete. Many of its greatest masters were dead. Others had lost faith in the Council's judgment and simply walked away. Some abandoned the code entirely, drifting into obscurity on remote worlds. Others went into deep hiding, severing ties with Coruscant and the Republic to avoid igniting another galactic conflict. What followed was not a clean reconstruction, but a slow unraveling. The Order was still present, yet felt strangely absent. Into that vacuum stepped a new kind of Sith threat, not an open empire with fleets and banners, but a wound in the Force, given form. Darth Nihilus was once a man scarred by the mass shadow generator at Malachor 5. Over time, the dark side twisted his body and spirit into a singular hunger. He no longer fed on food or power. In the conventional sense, he devoured life itself. Entire populations drained in moments, their voices falling, silent in the Force, until only the echo of his presence remained. Worlds became empty shells, orbiting dead suns. His counterpart in terror was Darth Sion, once a warrior whose body had been shattered beyond natural healing. Instead of dying, he bound himself to existence through pure pain and hatred. Every fracture, every scar held together by the dark side. His flesh constantly broken, yet unyielding. He could fall in battle and rise again, through will alone, a walking reminder that the dark side could deny even death. Though at a terrible cost, these two monsters did not act alone. Both served under a shadowed teacher, Darth Trier, a former Jedi historian who believed that both Jedi and Sith had betrayed the true nature of the Force together. They formed a Sith triumvirate and launched a silent purge. Rather than grand battles, they favored assassinations, ambushes, and carefully staged disappearances. Jedi, traveling alone, vanished on hyperspace routes. Enclaves on worlds such as Dantooine and Qatar fell not to invading armies but to unseen blades, and Nihilus's insatiable void. Communications between outposts went dark one by one. The Republic bureaucracy, distracted by rebuilding efforts and border disputes, barely noticed the pattern on paper. The Jedi still existed in reality. They were being erased for the surviving Jedi. Each new day brought deeper isolation. Masters cut themselves off from the Force. To hide, Padawans were told to trust no beacon. no call for aid. Every meeting might be a trap. Fear whispered that even the light side had abandoned them. In this gathering quiet, a final thread of hope began to move. An exiled Jedi general, long absent from the galactic stage, started a reluctant journey back from the fringes of known space, unaware that the Force was drawing them toward the heart of this last unseen war, and toward an enemy that intended to end the Jedi forever, the Jedi exile, and the end of the Dark Wars in the fading aftermath of the Jedi Civil War. The return of the exile began not with triumph, but with silence. Once a celebrated general of the Republic fleet, this wanderer had stood at Malachor 5 and given the final order that shattered the Mandalorian armada and tore a wound in the Force itself. What followed was not glory, but exile trial, and a mysterious severing from the very power that had once guided every breath and movement around 5 years after Revan's disappearance. The exile drifted back into known space, unconscious, aboard a battered freighter bound for the Paragus mining facility, cut off from the Force, and haunted by echoes of dead worlds. This former Jedi carried an absence that others could feel a void where the Force should have been. Yet that void was not empty. It was a wound that drew connections to others through shared pain and memory. From Paragus to Telos and beyond, the story of the exile became a quiet journey across a wounded republic. Each world visited revealed another fragment of the Sith's hidden purge on Nar Shaddaa. Desperate refugees whispered of Jedi vanishing without a trace on Dantooine shattered enclaves, spoke of hunters who struck from the shadows on Onderon royal courts, trembled as dark influences pulled at the fragile balance of power. Over time, a pattern emerged. This was not random chaos, but a deliberate erasure of the Jedi from galactic history. Along the way, the exile gathered allies and former Jedi Knights, a disillusioned historian on Dantooine, a conflicted handmaiden from Telos, a haunted warrior from Onderon, even an old mentor who saw in the exile both terrible danger and fragile hope. Each companion was drawn into that wound in the Force, their fates entwined by shared choices in war, and in its long, uneasy aftermath. The first great confrontation came with Darth Nihilus above Telos. This Lord of Hunger had become something less than a man and more than a wound, a being who devoured entire worlds through the dark side. Where others saw only unstoppable power, the exile saw a reflection of Malachor's emptiness. The battle that followed was fought with blades and with will. The exile refused to be consumed, to let guilt and absence become hunger. And in that refusal, Nihilus's endless appetite finally met a boundary it could not swallow on Malachor 5. The dead world that had started it all. The exile faced Darth Sion, a Sith whose body was held together by pain and hatred. Alone, every wound he suffered only bound him tighter to the dark side. Victory came not through killing him, but through breaking that cycle, confronting the idea that endless suffering was strength, until Sion chose at last to let go. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history in ways he could never see. Deeper still, in the shadowed halls of the Treyas Academy, waited Darth Traya, once Kreia mentor and exile herself. She had come to believe that the Force was a prison, binding all life to an endless pattern of conflict. Her answer was simple and terrifying: sever the galaxy's connection to the Force, end both Sith and Jedi forever. The final reckoning between teacher and student turned not on raw power but on philosophy and choice. The exile proved that connection did not have to mean control, that the light side could emerge even from the deepest wound by refusing Traya's vision and sparing those who could still change. The exile preserved the possibility of renewal. In the quiet that followed the Dark Wars, the Jedi Order existed only as a handful of scattered survivors and uncertain students. Yet from this almost total absence, a new beginning took shape. Hidden enclaves slowly reopened, lost holocrons were recovered, and the Republic entered another uneasy peace, unaware that in the far dark beyond known space, the true Sith Empire watched and waited for the next 1,000 years of conflict to unfold. The true Sith in hiding, a 1,000-year shadow. In that uneasy silence after the Dark War's power did not vanish, It simply moved out of sight if the Jedi and the Republic were slowly stitching themselves back together. Who was watching from the shadows? The answer was the true Sith Empire. For the next 1,000 years, beyond the edge of every star chart, an ancient sovereign shaped a hidden destiny. This was the same Dark Emperor who had survived the Great Hyperspace War, the being once known as Darth Vitiate. Sustained by a colossal ritual that consumed his own world, he retreated into the unknown regions. There, he rebuilt an empire far from the reach of the Republic and beyond even the distant rumors of the Jedi. The story of this secret empire was one of patience rather than open conquest. Instead of striking immediately, the Emperor studied history. He examined the failures of Naga Sado's reckless gambles, the infighting that had shattered Revan's legacy, and the starvation of power that had broken the Sith triumvirate. What followed was a cold calculation. He would construct a Sith state that could strike hard, then disappear behind treaties and negotiation, only to strike again. When the galaxy relaxed over time, entire generations were born beneath this hidden banner. On Droman Khas and other concealed strongholds, children grew up under a sky choked with storm clouds and warships. They were taught that the Republic was a corrupt, decaying enemy that had nearly exterminated their ancestors. Even though they had never seen Coruscant, their lives revolved around preparation drills in harsh academies, indoctrination in the dark side, and constant reminders that one day the Empire would return to make that promise real. The Emperor ordered vast world ships and hidden shipyards constructed in deep space, and behind nebula veils, fleets were assembled in complete secrecy. Prototype starfighters, stealth cruisers, and legions of Sith warriors trained in coordinated assault rather than chaotic rivalry. The Empire's intelligence networks learned to infiltrate from afar, sending agents to test hyperspace routes, map forgotten sectors, and quietly probe the Republic's new borders without revealing their masters. Meanwhile, in the known galaxy, the surface of history seemed almost calm. The Republic wrestled with local conflicts, trade disputes, and political corruption. The Jedi Order focused on rebuilding temples, recovering holocrons, and training a new generation that had only distant holovid records of Revan, Malak, and Nihilus to study. To many citizens the age of galaxy-spanning Sith, war felt remote, a cautionary tale rather than an imminent threat. That contrast was the Emperor's greatest weapon. While senators argued over budgets and Jedi debated philosophy, a storm was thickening just out of sight. The true Sith Emperor waited, feeding on the dark side, refining strategies, and choosing the moment when every distraction would align. After a millennium of preparation, his hidden empire finally judged the Republic weak enough and divided enough to face a renewed onslaught, and the next great galactic conflict moved quietly into place. The Great Galactic War. Return of the Sith Empire. The hidden preparations of the true Sith Emperor ended not with a warning, but with a sudden tearing open of the sky. One moment the core worlds moved through their quiet routines. The next, hyperspace spat out dagger-shaped silhouettes in perfect formation. The resurgent Sith Empire had returned fleets, emerged over Korriban's old enemies, and over worlds that had never heard a Sith name. And what followed was a carefully orchestrated storm from the first hours. The Republic realized this was no scattered cult. The Sith had come as a state, as an empire with carriers, dreadnoughts, and disciplined legions. Their capital ships dropped out of hyperspace in synchronized waves, jamming communications, severing trade lanes, and striking command hubs before local defenses could fully power shields on worlds such as Alderaan and Bothawui. Orbital platforms were overwhelmed in minutes, not days. The story of the Great Galactic War began with surprise as its sharpest weapon. For centuries, Republic scholars had treated the Sith as a cautionary tale in dusty archives, a threat buried in history. For thousands of years, the Jedi had focused on internal disputes, Mandalorian remnants, and pirate kings, not on the return of an ancient dark-side empire. So when red-sabered boarding parties cut through blast doors and black-armored Sith troops moved with drilled precision, shock rippled through the Senate chambers. This was not the chaotic brutality remembered from Revan's era. This was strategy tailored to known weaknesses. Intelligence gathered over time had given the true Emperor a map of the Republic's fault lines. Early campaigns targeted key shipyards at Fondor and Corellia, where the loss of dry-docked and half-completed cruisers crippled new construction in the Rim. Sith task forces struck relay stations and fuel depots, forcing Republic admirals to stretch already thin patrols. Meanwhile, in the core sieges erupted around worlds such as Coruscant's neighboring systems, the site of Sith battlecruisers hanging over the glittering Ecumenopolis itself, even briefly sent waves of fear through the galactic population. On the front lines, the war reshaped the role of the Force in open conflict. Jedi and Sith no longer met as isolated duelists on forgotten temple worlds. They served as generals and champions embedded within vast armies. At the Battle of Alderaan, Jedi strike groups led precision assaults against Sith artillery, while Sith lords used battle meditation and terror tactics to fracture enemy morale on Botha Way. A handful of Jedi held the line against a larger Sith force, turning the planet into a symbol of resistance. Even as other systems fell, psychologically, the impact was profound. The comforting belief that the Sith were extinct shattered overnight holonet images of crimson blades igniting in Senate districts and in once peaceful plazas told an older truth. An enemy the Republic had dismissed had been watching, patiently adjusting tactics and preparing fleets for the next 1,000 years. Every new Sith victory whispered the same message. The past was not done with the present. Yet the Great Galactic War would not reach its infamous turning point in a climactic fleet engagement. Instead, the true Emperor prepared something colder, a diplomatic gesture masking a blade, a move aimed not at distant borders, but at the very heart of Republican power. The day would come when those same hyperspace shadows fell directly over Coruscant, and what they found there would change everything. The sacking of Coruscant and the treaty. That froze a war power can be measured in fleets and armies, but in the old Republic, it was often decided by timing and deception. What happens when an empire uses peace talks as the perfect distraction for annihilation? The answer is the sacking of Coruscant and the treaty that froze a war without ending it as the Great Galactic War. Dragged on, the Republic believed it had finally read the rhythm of Sith strategy. Most major Imperial thrusts hammered the mid-rim, and the deep-core border worlds burned under crimson turbo-laser fire. Entire task forces vanished into hyperspace to meet these threats. The Senate and the Jedi Council assumed this was the decisive phase of the conflict. In reality, the true Sith Emperor was arranging pieces for a single stroke that would shape galactic history across multiple sectors. Imperial commanders launched coordinated feints. Worlds of little long-term value were attacked with dramatic force. Distress calls flooded Coruscant as trade lanes collapsed and colonies begged for aid. The Republic High Command shifted its best fleets away from the core, confident that the Empire was overextending. What followed was absence. The space around Coruscant grew strangely quiet. Patrols reported nothing. No battle groups, no raiding parties, only empty hyperlanes hidden behind layers of jamming and false sensor ghosts. A cloaked Sith armada advanced on the capital when the ships finally dropped from hyperspace above Coruscant. The illusion shattered in an instant. Sith warships descended through the atmosphere, disgorging drop pods and shuttles into the heart of the Ecumenopolis. The Senate district became a battlefield as black-armored troops and crimson-bladed warriors marched between gleaming towers that had stood for thousands of years. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant came under direct assault, its spires wreathed in smoke as Sith strike teams breached ancient halls. Statues of past Jedi Masters toppled under detonations, archives burned, and meditation chambers echoed with the clash of the dark side and the light side elsewhere across the city. Government plazas and financial centers fell. Block by block, flames climbed into the artificial sky, while panicked citizens fled through streets choked with debris. Far from this devastation, Republic diplomats sat across from Imperial representatives at peace negotiations, believing they held leverage through stubborn resistance then. The message arrived. Coruscant was burning the Senate hostage, the temple in ruins. The Sith Emperor offered a simple choice: accept his terms or watch the capital be systematically destroyed to the last district. This was not mercy, yet in practice, the decision to yield spared billions. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. The Treaty of Coruscant forced the Republic to recognize all major Sith territorial gains, vast regions of the Outer Rim, and former neutral systems passed under Imperial rule. Demilitarized zones cut across old trade routes. Allies were abandoned garrisons, recalled in disgrace. Open war ended on paper, but the story of the conflict merely changed form in the years that followed. The galaxy entered an uneasy Cold War. Each superpower ruled its sphere of influence through fear promises and the constant threat of renewed annihilation. Battlefields shrank into shadows. Espionage replaced armadas as agents hunted secrets on Nar Shaddaa, Droman Kars, and Coruscant itself. Proxy wars erupted on border worlds where deniable forces clashed, while governments insisted on peace. Over time, skirmishes along contested sectors became a deadly routine. Each incident a test probing for weakness. For the next 1,000 years, historians would look back on this moment as the hinge of an era. The Sith Empire had proven it could strike the Republic's heart. The Republic had proven it would survive even humiliation rather than face total destruction. The Treaty of Coruscant did not end the struggle between dark and light. It froze it suspended in tension, waiting for the day when the cold quiet of the border would once again ignite into open war. Cold War and proxy battles, life between empires. In the silence that followed the Treaty of Coruscant, the galaxy did not heal. It held its breath. Power had not vanished, it had only changed shape. What happens when a war ends, but the hatred and ambition that fueled it remain? The answer is a Cold War that seeps into every border, whirled every shadowed cantina, every whispered transmission across the stars in the years after the sacking of Coruscant. The front lines dissolved into shifting zones of influence. Entire sectors became fault lines between Republic and Sith Empire. These were worlds where a single trade agreement or security pact could decide whether Jedi or Sith warships appeared in orbit. What followed was a dangerous kind of diplomacy. Planetary governors and crime lords learned to read the currents of galactic politics one month. A world flew the Republic crest the next. It quietly accepted Sith advisors in exchange for protection or power on planets such as Balmorra and Alderaan. The Cold War never truly felt cold. Factories changed hands in covert operations, militias rose and fell, as off-the-record arms shipments arrived under cover of humanitarian aid. Over time, the story of these worlds became one of survival, more than ideology. Local leaders bargained with both sides, promising loyalty to whoever could guarantee that their cities would not be the next to burn. Some succeeded, others vanished in night raids that were never officially acknowledged in this tense equilibrium. Information became more valuable than fleets. Republic Strategic Information Service cells and Imperial intelligence networks spread through neutral space agents, traded in secrets, blackmail codes, and intercepted hyperspace routes. Smugglers and independent captains found new profit running data chips instead of Spice One. Quiet jump past a customs patrol could decide the fate of an entire campaign. Yet the same currents crushed many of them when operations were exposed. Ships disappeared in deep space, their loss written off as navigation error rather than covert execution. The Jedi and the Sith adapted to this new era of veiled conflict. Grand battles gave way to undercover missions. Robed ambassadors arrived on distant worlds, speaking of peace, while covert teams moved ahead of them, disabling defenses or securing allies. Jedi negotiated ceasefires between planetary factions, hoping to keep them from falling to the dark side. Sith diplomats offered order and strength to those who feared Republic abandonment. Each side tried to sway neutral systems through a mixture of promise and quiet threat. For ordinary citizens, the weight of this balance was exhausting. Hyperlanes could close overnight as treaties shifted. Families awoke to find that their homeworld now lay under Sith jurisdiction or Republic occupation. The constant rumor that the next skirmish might ignite full war again settled into the collective mind as a dull anxiety. It was a galaxy suspended between dark and light, yet beyond this fragile stalemate. In regions few charts recorded a different power stirred neither Republic nor Sith Empire. What they found there would change everything, and the Cold War would no longer define the limits of galactic history. The eternal empire of Zakul, a third power, rises beyond the fragile Republic Sith. Sekshit's stalemate. In the known galaxy, another vision of power had already taken root far from Coruscant, and Droman Kars Hidden in the unknown regions, a single world had grown into something neither Senate nor Dark Council had anticipated. This was Zakuul, and what followed was the quiet rise of a third empire. For thousands of years, explorers had feared the starless depths beyond familiar hyperlanes. Yet in those uncharted reaches, Zakuul flourished, its skies pierced by towering spires, its people sustained by advanced automation and a level of technology that made even core world shipyards seem primitive. The eternal empire of Zakuul expanded inward rather than outward, perfecting its eternal fleet, while the Republic and Sith bled each other in war. The galaxy saw stalemate. Zakuul saw opportunity at the heart of this hidden power. Stood Valkorion, an emperor who did not shout or posture. He spoke softly, with the calm assurance of one who understood the Force on a scale few could imagine his presence. In the dark, and the light side felt ancient, layered with a history that stretched back through other names, other lives. He presented himself as a benevolent ruler, promising order, prosperity, and an end to pointless conflict to his citizens. He was a savior, not a tyrant, yet the story of Valkorion was more complex than any public proclamation. Beneath the serene exterior lay a will honed over centuries, and an understanding that empires endure not only through fear, but through dependency over time. Zakuul's citizens came to rely completely on eternal empire systems, droids, and the omnipresent eternal fleet. The line between loyalty and necessity blurred until resistance felt impossible. The eternal fleet itself was the true instrument of galactic transformation, composed of automated, hyper-advanced warships guided by sophisticated control systems. It could appear without warning above any world. Ancient Sith fortresses and proud Republic shipyards found themselves outmatched by vessels that did not tire, did not question, and did not retreat. Coordinated strikes shattered key strongholds in a matter of days. Worlds that had survived decades of war fell in hours. The shock was immediate and profound. The Republic, accustomed to viewing the Sith as its primary rival, suddenly faced a power that dismissed Senate diplomacy as irrelevant. The Sith Empire, long defined by its hatred of the Republic, discovered an enemy that did not fear the dark side and did not care about ancient grudges. Both were offered the same choice: submit as vassals within a new imperial order, or resist and be broken. Many systems bowed their heads. Others burned in this moment. The old binary of Jedi and Sith no longer fully defined galactic history. The eternal throne on Zakuul became the new axis around which power would shape the era. Yet even here, nothing was truly eternal beneath Valkorion's composed rule. Rival heirs, conspirators, and hidden legacies gathered like storm clouds in the coming struggle for that throne would fracture the galaxy in ways neither Republic nor Sith Empire were prepared to face. Knights of the fallen empire, resistance, alliances, and the eternal throne. Under Valkorion's calm gaze, the old certainties of the galaxy began to dissolve. Power no longer flowed cleanly between Republic and Sith Empire. It radiated instead from a single throne on distant Zakuul. But what happens when an entire era is forced to bend around one man's will? The answer is the story of resistance alliances and the long shadow of the eternal throne in the early years of Zakuulan rule. Heroes from both sides of the old conflict were removed from the board. Some were captured in the surprise invasions. Others were frozen in carbonite or drawn into Valkorion's orbit as reluctant instruments. A Jedi Knight who once defended the Republic found themselves crowned as the immortal Emperor's new champion. A former Sith Wrath who had hunted traitors for the Dark Council now fought under banners that were neither Imperial nor Republic. What followed was a blurring of loyalties in which old colors meant little, and survival meant accepting a place within Valkorion's carefully constructed order. Over time cracks formed beneath that polished surface, Zakuul's knights enforced the Emperor's will with almost religious devotion. Yet across the galaxy, scattered survivors began to organize resistance cells, smugglers running quiet supply lines to hidden bases, Republic commandos and Imperial agents sharing intelligence. Jedi and Sith meditating in the same war rooms, not out of friendship, but out of shared necessity on Odessum. a remote and forgotten world, an alliance took shape. Its leaders drawn from every corner of previous wars, its fleets a patchwork of stolen Eternal Empire vessels, battered Republic cruisers, and refitted Imperial destroyers. At the heart of this struggle lay the Eternal Throne itself. More than a symbol, it was a conduit to the vast Eternal Fleet. Whoever sat upon it could command droid armadas capable of crushing worlds. Valkorian's apparent death transformed the throne into a prize that would shape the fate of the era. His children, Arkan and Valen, waged a brutal family war, each molded by the dark side, and their father's manipulations, each convinced the throne was their birthright. The former Outlander, championed by Valkorian's lingering spirit, became a third contender caught between rejecting the Emperor's legacy and using that same power to end the conflict. As these personal battles raged, traditional structures decayed. The Republic Senate operated in exile, more a debating circle than a government. The Sith Dark Council fractured into competing fiefdoms. As some lords pledged to the alliance, others secretly bargained with Zaku, and a few clung to fading hierarchies. For thousands of years, the galaxy had oscillated between Republic order and Sith dominion. Now neither vision could claim to define galactic history when the Eternal Empire finally began to break under internal revolt and external assault. The collapse did not restore a simple balance. Instead, regional powers, militias, and independent worlds asserted themselves. The Force still flowed through Jedi and Sith, but their institutions no longer framed every major decision. The fall of the Eternal Throne opened a new chapter, one in which no single Empire Senate or Order could claim true control, and the uncertain age that followed would be far less stable than anything that had come before. The fading of the Old Republic. From legends to prequels, in that fractured landscape of warlords and provisional councils, a quieter transformation began to unfold. Power had shattered into 1,000 pieces, but what happens when those pieces slowly drift back together? The answer is the fading of the Old Republic and the rise of something more familiar. Over time, the phrase Old Republic came to mean less a single senate or constitution and more an era, a long stretch of galactic history defined by Jedi service, fragile coalitions, and recurring Sith shadows. For thousands of years, the name followed the institutions, even as those institutions changed charters, capitals, and borders. The story of this age was not one clean rise and fall, but a series of slow adjustments after every conflict in the centuries, after the Great Galactic War, the Cold War, and the Eternal Empire's collapse. What followed was not another sudden catastrophe, but gradual centralization. Exhausted worlds turned once more to Coruscant, seeking stability. Trade routes were recharted, defense pacts standardized, and local militias folded into a more coherent Republic. Military scars from bombardments and occupations were rebuilt in Transparasteel and Duracrete, until the old battle lines faded beneath new skylines. Institutionally, the Jedi changed as well. Earlier in the Old Republic, they had stood as a semi-independent order, answering to the Force first and to politicians' second. Repeated crises convinced both sides that closer coordination meant safety. Slowly, oversight committees, permanent liaisons, and emergency powers bound the Jedi more tightly to the Senate. Their temple on Coruscant became not only a spiritual center, but an official arm of galactic policy, a place where ambassadors and generals negotiated under the watch of robed guardians as the Sith retreated into the shadows. Their presence in public memory dimmed what had once been very real invasions, and empires hardened into legend. Most citizens knew the word Sith only from archived holodramas and half-remembered histories. The dark side was still feared, but in an abstract way, distant and almost academic. New political parties filled the vacuum corporate blocs. Trade guilds and banking clans rose to prominence, their fleets and credits, shaping outcomes that ancient Sith armies once would have seized by force by the final centuries. Before the films, Coruscant stood again as a gleaming capital, its ecumenopolis. Surface crowded with towers and traffic lanes, the Jedi Temple's spires cut a familiar silhouette against the sky, its archives quietly recording that the Sith had been extinct for a millennium by the time of the Phantom Menace. Or so the Jedi believed from orbit. The galaxy appeared calm, a unified Republic Senate presiding over peace treaties and commercial accords. Yet beneath that surface, many of the same patterns remained: corruption, threaded through committees; complacency, dulled the vigilance of both senators and Jedi; and the dark side waited patiently in forgotten tombs and secret lineages. The institutions had new names and faces, but the currents of fear, ambition, and control that would shape the Clone Wars were already moving just out of sight. Echoes through time. How old Republic choices shaped the Skywalker era. In the quiet centuries that followed the last great Old Republic wars, the surface of galactic life appeared stable, yet the Force carried echoes of older choices. Patterns laid down when the Republic and the Jedi were young began to repeat themselves in more polished halls and brighter chambers. The story of the prequel era was already being written in forgotten councils on Tython Ossus and Coruscant. Tens of thousands of years earlier, early Jedi philosophers had argued fiercely over attachment, emotion, and power. How much feeling could a Jedi safely hold? How close could Guardians stand to the people they defended without falling to the dark side? What followed was a long series of schisms, from the 100-Year Darkness to the exile of the first Dark Jedi. Each failure pushed the Order towards stricter rules over time vows, against attachment hardened into near-absolute prohibitions by the days of the High Council on Coruscant. Their fear was not new. It was the accumulated memory of ancient betrayals in parallel. The Sith learned different lessons. For thousands of years, their empires had risen in fire and fallen in spectacle. Naga Sado's doomed. Invasion, Revan's open war. The Emperor of Droman Khas revealing himself too boldly. Each empire believed sheer power would crush the Republic, yet each collapse taught the dark side another cruel efficiency. By the time Sheev Palpatine emerged from Naboo, he carried a strategy refined through millennia. His hidden rule of two, his patient manipulation of the Senate and the Jedi would shape the final age of the Republic far more effectively than any fleet of warships. Long before clone troopers marched under Jedi generals, the Order had already blurred the line between monk and soldier. The Mandalorian Wars drew reluctant Jedi into command roles. Revan and Malak turned that emergency into conquest. The Jedi Civil War forced surviving masters to question whether wielding armies had poisoned their purpose. Later, the Great Galactic War and the sacking of Coruscant again pressed Jedi into leading campaigns for the Senate. Each time, the Republic relied on them as both peacekeepers and warriors each. Time-moral compromises followed when the Clone Wars began, and rogue negotiators became battlefield commanders. It was not an accident, it was repetition. Beneath these spiritual and political patterns lay older foundations. Still, hyperspace routes, mapped by daring explorers in the early Republic, continued to funnel power through the core worlds. Coruscant's dominance as a galactic capital, the very idea of a Senate chamber where thousands of systems debated law, all of it came from old Republic experiments in shared government. Even Palpatine's empire ruled through structures first raised in hope. Seen from a distance, the Skywalker saga becomes another crest in a long wave of light side and dark side, Republic and Empire, ancient debates over love and fear, ancient gambits of secrecy and control, all converged on Anakin, on Padme, on a single chancellor in a crowded chamber. Yet the currents behind them were far older than any one family, as the Clone Wars ignite and an empire waits just beyond the horizon. Another question rises with them. What forgotten precedent from the old Republic will awaken next? Patterns in the Force, rise, fall, and the long memory of history. For thousands of years, the old Republic rose and faltered on currents that began long before the Clone Wars. The story of this era is not only a chain of battles and treaties, but a repeating pattern in the Force itself. Again and again, discovery led to order, order led to division, and what followed was war. The pattern began when early mystics on Tython first listened to the Force and tried to give it structure. They formed the first gatherings that would become the Jedi Order temples. Rose on Tython, and later on Coruscant councils were convened. Codes were written, yet even in those first halls, the same questions whispered at the edge of meditation. How should power be used? Who decides when? The needs of the many outweigh the will of the one. Over time, answers hardened into doctrine. Some Jedi urged restraint, others pressed for decisive action. The 100-Year Darkness made those disagreements visible in the most violent way. When Dark Jedi embraced the dark side to pursue victory at any cost, they were cast out. What they found there would change everything. Exile led them to Korriban, to the Sith species, to an empire built openly on passion and conquest, and the cycle took on a new shape. Jedi on one side, Sith on the other. The Republic caught between. From the Great Hyperspace War to the Mandalorian Wars, the same tensions resurfaced. Naga Sado's illusions over Coruscant Revan's decision to defy the Council and join the Mandalorian front. Each moment circled the same dilemma, whether to wait and preserve principle or to seize initiative and risk corruption. Revan's fall, Malak's betrayal, and the burning of worlds under the Starforge showed how quickly a crusade for protection could become a campaign of domination. After each catastrophe, the galaxy tried to forget, but the Force did not. The Dark Wars that followed Revan, the hunger of Darth Nihilus, the cold endurance of Darth Sion, the slow rebuilding under the Exile, all echoed the first schisms on Tython, later the return of the Sith Empire from Dromund Kaas, the sacking of Coruscant, and even the rise of the Eternal Empire of Zakul repeated the rhythm. A new power emerges, claims to bring order, unleashes conflict, then fractures under the weight of its own fear. Seen from far enough away, the galaxy resembles a living organism. The Force is its nervous system, carrying memories of every Jedi Council debate, every Sith ritual, every act of mercy, and every act of vengeance long after records are lost. That memory flows through new generations, nudging them toward familiar crossroads. Eventually dates blur the difference between a battle over Coruscant in one millennium and a siege in another, softens into a single impression. Lessons more than names, patterns more than titles, as this long arc settles the rise and fall of Republican. Empire of Jedi and Sith becomes a slowly dimming constellation in the mind, an outline, rather than a map. Now the specifics of hyperspace routes, councils and campaigns can drift away. The broad shape remains: discovery, order, division, war, fragile peace, then renewal, waiting for the next spark as the old Republic nears its end. Those ancient patterns are about to surface one final time, in a new form, under a different empire and a different war, drifting back through eras. A slow recap of the old Republic as those patterns surface again. The timeline can be gathered up, gently held at arm's length, and seen as a single slow arc, rather than scattered flashes of war and empire. It begins in silence before fleets and councils, before the Republic even has a name. There are only scattered worlds, feeling their way through the dark of interstellar night, fragile beacons on Coruscant, on Alsakan, on distant Corellia, sending out test jumps into the unknown. Their navigators trace the first hyperspace, routes, thin, glowing threads across a dangerous void. One miscalculation from disaster among these early wanderers-seekers on the storm-racked world of Tython. Listen to something older than stars, the raw, untamed force. It crashes over them in waves of light side and dark side together. And what they found there would change everything. Their debates, their meditations, their first hesitant codes are the beginning of the Jedi. And of every conflict to come off Tython and across the core, those routes knit into a network. And from that network, the Galactic Republic is born a promise of shared law and mutual defense. When this fledgling Republic meets the Jedi, an alliance forms that would shape galactic history. For thousands of years, guardians and diplomats side by side. But power never rests quietly in so many minds and hearts. The first shadows are already gathering during the 100-Year Darkness. Ambitious Jedi push, deeper into forbidden techniques, shaping flesh-bending life itself around their will. The Order fractures into open war. The victors drive the dark experimenters into exile, believing the danger ended. Instead, what followed was the birth of the Sith as a separate tradition on Korriban and Zeost. Among crimson-skinned natives and endless tombs, a new empire rises in the image of wounded pride and hunger. From there, the pace quickens. The Great Hyperspace War erupts when Naga Sado turns secret routes into invasion corridors. His fleets burn worlds, but internal Sith rivalry and Jedi resistance shatter his campaign. The Republic surges outward in response, fortifying borders, reshaping maps. Yet the cycle continues. Mandalorian crusaders test those borders, next armored legions sweeping across the outer rim, while the Council hesitates until Revan and Malak break ranks. Their intervention ends one war, but opens another Revan's fall. The Starforge, the Jedi Civil War. Then the quieter devastation of the Dark Wars, when Nihilus Siam and a scattered Sith triumvirate hunt the Order almost to extinction. Over time, the Republic survives only as a scarred framework, holding on through habit and memory. Then the true Sith Empire returns from deep space. The Great Galactic War, the sacking of Coruscant, and a long Cold War freeze the galaxy in tense stalemate, only to be broken by a new force entirely. The Eternal Empire of Zakuul, its eternal fleet, descending on both Republic and Sith. What followed was conquest from above that ignores old boundaries. The fall of that eternal throne does not bring simple peace. Instead, the old Republic thins and stretches, gradually becoming the more familiar Republic of the prequel era. Jedi and Senate, still present, but change the story of this age, does not close. It only fades into the next chapter, waiting just beyond the rim of sleep, where another Republic and another war are already beginning to fall. The galaxy at rest, letting the old Republic fade into night. The fall of that eternal throne does not bring simple peace instead. The old Republic thins and stretches, gradually becoming the more familiar Republic of the prequel era. Jedi and Senate still present, but change the story of this age does not close. It only fades into the next chapter, waiting just beyond the rim of sleep, where another Republic and another war are already beginning to form. Yet even that next Republic, in all its turmoil, becomes, from far enough away, only another passing pattern against a wider night over time. The noise of debate in the Senate chambers on Coruscant softens the shouts and proclamations that once decided the fate of worlds recede into a distant murmur, until they are no louder than a memory. Corridors that once shook with arguments over war and peace stand empty. The great rotunda still lit, but quiet, its light falling on vacant podiums and silent repulsor pods, drifting in slow, aimless circles far from the core. The battlefields of the old Republic restworld that once burned under Mandalorian bombardment or Sith orbital strikes lie under calm skies again. Craters fill with rain, and then with soil grass spreads across scarred plains until the last trace of trenches disappears. Armor and shattered droids sink beneath the surface, layer upon layer, until for thousands of years they remain buried relics of conflicts that no longer demand attention in forgotten sectors. Ancient Jedi and Sith temples stand untouched by visitors, stone halls on Tython and Ossus that once echoed with the clash of training sabers now hear only wind and the faint hum of the Force through old crystal chambers. What followed was not another great crusade, but a long, slow stillness. Statues of Jedi Masters and Dark Lords watch over empty sanctuaries, their carved eyes turned toward stars that no longer remember their names in orbit around long, quiet worlds. Derelict starships, drift hulls pitted by micrometeorites, metal frameworks collapsing grain by grain over spans that outlast any single empire once. These vessels carried fleets into the Great Hyperspace War and the Great Galactic War. Now they turn soundlessly in the dark side, and the light side no longer contested within their corridors. Only the patient pull of gravity, and time remains. The old Republic is both gone and present at once. Its laws repealed, its banners faded, its enemies and allies reduced to entries in galactic archives, yet its choices would shape every era that follows the Jedi who hesitated in the Mandalorian Wars, the senators who signed uneasy truces with Sith and Eternal Empire envoys, the exiles who listened to the Force in the quiet between battles all leave faint currents that continue to flow beneath later histories. Names that once defined ages, Revan, Malak, Satele Shan, Valkorion, Nagasado, drift toward the edge of awareness. They can fall away now. Worlds that once anchored maps, Taris, Korriban, Zakuul, Alderaan, Onderon, can loosen and dissolve, what remains is only a sense of vastness, of stories layered upon stories all held within. The same invisible current that binds the galaxy together. There is no need to hold the entire timeline in place. It waits, perfectly preserved, in holocrons and archives on Ossus, in Jedi vaults beneath Coruscant, in Sith datacrons hidden in forgotten tombs. What they found there would change everything for historians and seekers in ages to come. But in this moment, the Old Republic can rest, and the listener can rest with it. The Force carries every war, every act of mercy, every fall and every return to the light side. And now, as the galaxy dims to a quiet starfield of distant suns, that long, bright, troubled history lies down and sleeps. A last look at the stars, the Old Republic's endless horizon. In the hush that follows such long remembrance, the Old Republic stretches out not as a straight line, but as a horizon behind the familiar films, a broad band of faint light where countless lives once moved through the dark. Beyond the names that dominate galactic history, entire generations of Jedi, Sith, smugglers, senators, soldiers, and quiet citizens rose and fell beneath those same stars. From the first tentative hyperspace scouts threading routes between core worlds, to the last weary admirals signing truces after the Great Galactic War, the story of this republic is never only the Great Councils and the open conflict. Between the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War, there are unrecorded evenings in outpost temples where young Jedi meditated on the light side while distant artillery thudded beyond the horizon. On Coruscant, clerks filed reports on trade disputes, while in the same hour, fleets clashed at Malachor 5 and Rakata Prime. Every era passed through. Tonight is only a thin slice of a far larger tapestry. Around the time Revan vanished into the unknown regions, a farmer on Dantooine guided a battered speeder through early frost, unaware that what followed was a slow rebuilding that would shape the next century. While the eternal empire of Zakuul loomed over Republic and Sith Empire alike, children on Alderaan watched orbital lights flicker and thought only of distant travelers, not of war. Over time, governments changed their banners, senates shifted chambers, and empires rose and fell. But the Force remained the quiet constant. For thousands of years it flowed through Jedi enclaves on Tython, through Sith tombs on Korriban, through the crowded skylanes of Coruscant and the empty snows of Megiddo. It watched the dark side swell in figures such as Naga Sadow, Darth Nihilus, and Valkorion, then recede again as the light side gathered in scattered survivors, exiles, and forgotten knights. In this long view, the Force is a patient witness. It does not hurry the fall of an empire or the healing of a scarred world. It simply holds every triumph and every tragedy in the same steady current, unchanged by the passing of chancellors, dark councils, and eternal thrones. As this history settles, the stars above the Old Republic begin to dim, one by one. Not in catastrophe, but gently, as though a vast galactic hall is closing after a performance that has lasted millennia. The brilliant lines of traffic over Coruscant fade to embers. The great fleet musters above Corellia. Onderon and Elam withdraw into shadow. Temple spires on Ossus and Tython become silhouettes, then outlines, then memory. In that soft dark, the Old Republic rests. Its conflicts quiet, its heroes and tyrants fall silent, and the Force folds their echoes into the background hum of the galaxy. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history for those still to come. But for now, it simply means that this long chronicle can sleep. The horizon remains, waiting to be walked again. Yet just beyond it, another age is already stirring, and what rises there will carry familiar shadows into a new republic. Sleep among the stars, gentle closure, and future journeys. The horizon remains waiting to be walked again, yet just beyond it, another age is already stirring, and what rises there will carry familiar shadows into a new republic. The long arc of Old Republic history bends quietly toward that distant future. But tonight, that future does not demand to be studied or remembered. It only needs to drift past like starlight on transparent steel. The story of this journey has stretched across forgotten empires, ancient Jedi councils, Sith uprisings, and galactic war for thousands of years of in-universe time. And for many quiet minutes in the present, it has moved at its own steady pace. And what followed was never meant to be a test of attention or endurance. If sleep arrived in the middle of a Mandalorian campaign, a Senate debate, or a Jedi civil war, then the Old Republic has already done its work. The purpose of this chronicle is simple: to give the mind a gentle structure to follow, while the body loosens its grip on the day names of worlds and orders of battle, provide soft landmarks along a path that does not need to be finished. The Force, the Republic, the Sith, the Jedi, all become distant constellations, familiar enough to recognize, yet far enough away that their details can safely blur. Over time, some listeners remain half awake at this point, hovering between awareness and dream. Others have long since gone quiet. Both outcomes serve the same end. There is no need to recall the exact year of the Great Hyperspace War, or the precise sequence of treaties after the sacking of Coruscant. Those events now are only quiet ripples in a wider galactic sea. Beyond the Old Republic, other eras wait patiently on the edge of consciousness. There are Sith histories that trace a single dark lineage from Ajunta Paul to Darth Sidious Jedi. Chronicles that follow the light side from the first temples on Tython to the archives of Coruscant, and long campaigns spanning the Clone Wars, where the Republic rises one last time before falling to a new empire. Each of these threads would shape another night, another slow unfolding of history told in the same measured tone. For any listener still present in this moment, the path grows softer now. Attention can turn away from battles and councils and toward the simple rhythm of breathing air in and air out, steady and unforced. With each breath, muscles grow heavier, the room grows quieter, and the mind can imagine a small vessel drifting between the stars of the Old Republic, far beyond the core, beyond the rim, until only the dark remains. In that calm darkness, there is no more conflict, only distance. Ancient worlds become faint lights scattered across a sleeping galaxy, and the Force settles into a slow, even tide. Let that tide carry thought a little farther away from names and dates and into wordless rest. The last echoes of this history will fade on their own leaving. Only silence and the sense of a journey completed somewhere far behind. The recording grows softer. The stars hold their places, and the night continues without the need for any further farewell.